All right, thank you guys for coming. So today is the Health Professions Advising Center's interviewing for a health professions workshop. So over the next about an hour and a half, we're going to talk about how to prepare for an interview, what's going to be expected during an interview day, what to do after an interview, how to follow up, and how to make an informed decision about what professional program you're going to select moving forward. So before we get started, I think it's helpful to be reminded of the competitiveness of these professional programs. So most of you have probably seen this data in one capacity or another over the years, but it's no shock to anybody that most of these programs are highly competitive, right? Nationally, most professional programs have about a 35% or 40% acceptance rate of the applicants that have applied. And then of course we all know GPA-wise, 3.6, 3.5, 3.4 are competitive GPAs for professional programs. So you guys know already that getting to the point that you have an interview, this is a common question, who gets interviewed? Getting to the point where you have an interview already means that you can identify yourself as a competitive applicant. It is really important for you guys to take away from this workshop that having an interview does identify you as a competitive applicant. Professional programs only interview applicants who they have determined are already competitive. They've already determined that they like what they've seen of you on paper, and they really truthfully are trying to confirm who you've already appeared to be, right? A professional program isn't going to interview somebody who they didn't like part of their personal statement or letters or secondary application or GPA or standardized exam scores. So by getting an interview, please give yourself a round of applause to know that you are a competitive applicant for a professional program. I know it's hard to believe. A lot of students move forward still thinking that the interview is still them begging for admissions, right? I get that a lot from students where they think that going into an interview, it's still an opportunity for an admissions committee to quote unquote weed them out. And I'm sure you guys have heard that or you feel that, but really this is an opportunity for them to weed you in. This is an opportunity for an admissions committee to see all of the wonderful things that they've already seen of you on paper and to have you confirm that you really truthfully are that person and to get accepted to a professional program. So congratulations on your interview offer. Also, I think it's helpful to sometimes understand, well, what process did a school go through in order to determine that I was a competitive applicant? And each school truthfully does have their own screening process, but I think in general, most schools are gonna first look at your cumulative GPA, science GPA, and standardized exam scores. First and foremost, it's those academic metrics that professional programs look at to really evaluate, is this somebody who's going to be competent or competitive to make it through our program. After that, they might look at your secondary supplemental application and your personal statement. So they might take a look at your qualitative parts of your application to see what's your story, what's your path. They'll also look at your extracurriculars or resume to see what types of things have you been involved in. You know, what did you do and what did you learn from those extracurriculars? Your letters of recommendation, so what do evaluators have to say about your ability to be a successful practitioner or student? Then for public institutions, they might also look at your state residency. So for the person who had an interview at USC, that's a private institution. They don't really care if you're a California resident or a New York resident. It's a private institution. They don't give any preference to geographical location. Where somebody who has an interview at UCSF, that's a state institution, and primarily I would say probably about 80% of students who are going to get accepted probably are going to come within the state of California. So private institutions and public institutions might look at your state residency or your geographical location differently when determining offering an interview or offering an acceptance. Okay, the purpose of the interview, again, I know it's really hard for students to believe this or accept this, but it really is to confirm that you are the person they already liked. They saw something in your primary and secondary application that they found desirable, and they want to make sure you're still authentically that person, that you didn't have so many people help polish your application that you potentially were lost. They want to make sure that your path and your experiences are true and genuine to your person. They also might want to learn more about you as a person and an applicant, particularly beyond your quantitative metrics like your GPA or your standardized exam. They might ask follow-up questions about why you engaged in a particular activity or what you learned from that activity, or maybe what was your most meaningful activity in your undergraduate experience. So it's to learn more about your person and your path to a professional program. Again, they might want to know why specifically are you interested in medicine, dentistry, pharmacy? What is your motivation for pursuing that profession? You've already touched on this in your personal statement, right? You already talked about how did you explore and confirm your interest in dentistry or pharmacy. So they might ask you that again in person to say, well, what again was your motivation for pursuing this profession? They might be assessing personal characteristics. This is particularly important with MMI, the multiple mini interviews, is they're assessing oral communication skills or service orientation or cultural competency. They might be assessing personal characteristics that program has deemed desirable for their program. They might be assessing those throughout your interview. They might want to learn just more about your commitments and your goals, your interest. What do you see with your future profession? What types of programming do you want to be involved with at their institution? What do you really see for your profession moving forward in 10 years? And then again, kind of coming back to characteristics, these interpersonal characteristics are things that are more easily assessed in an interview where you're interacting with somebody than they would be on paper when you are just in writing, articulating your interest. They might be looking at your ability to communicate, obviously verbal communication, connect and interact with others, which of course is critically important for healthcare providers, right? You have to connect with another person. They might be looking at your social consciousness or your maturity, particularly with like ethical type questions they might ask, your personal integrity, problem solving skills, community service, service to others, just a variety of interpersonal skills that are very difficult to evaluate on paper. They're much easier to evaluate when you're communicating and interacting with another person. It's fairly easy to identify somebody who genuinely has an interest or passion in the things that they've engaged in. Admissions committees review med school is about 6,000 applicants. Dental schools might be more 4,000 to 5,000 applicants. Schools evaluate thousands of applicants. So they really are able to identify when a student authentically has engaged in extracurricular experiences and really knows why they did something and what they got out of it. And that's sometimes hard to evaluate on paper when you've had a lot of people maybe polish your personal statement or your resume. But in an interview, when it's just you and the interviewer, it's easier to get to the heart of, did this person genuinely do these experiences? Do they really know why they did them and what they got out of them? And to be able to evaluate like the authenticity of the applicant and the person. So who will you be interviewing with? Depends, could be a lot of different people. Faculty, whether that's researching faculty, like people who have PhDs, who generally teach first and second year curriculum, or clinical faculty, somebody who has an MD, a PhD, or a DDS. Could be clinicians in the community, so people that do have MDs, PharmDs, and DDSs, but necessarily aren't on staff for that medical school, dental school, or pharmacy school. They could be community members, people that are just invested and engaged in the university. Alumni, so people who have graduated from that program. First or second year students. This is always an interesting one because a first year student may have started medical school or dental school 3 months ago, maybe even 2 months ago. And they might now have the shoe on the other foot where now they're a part of the admissions committee. So the tables can turn rather quickly once you get accepted to a professional program. And then lastly, you might have admissions officers or other professional staff like Charlie or myself, the equivalent of somebody who might be on the student affairs staff who might be involved either in your interview day or the admissions committee itself. Before the interview, we really encourage you to do quite a bit of research about the institution in which you're going to be interviewing at. Ideally, as it says at the bottom here, this is something that you did prior to applying, right? So you've already spent probably hundreds of dollars to apply to these institutions. So ideally, I would have liked for you to evaluate some of these things prior to having applied, But now that you're here and we're talking about interviewing, if you didn't really have a chance to evaluate these things prior to applying, you should definitely do that before you go in and interview. So be familiar with the size and the location, particularly the mission of the institution that you're interviewing at. So for those of you who do have interviews, you should be reading up on the history of the program, the mission of the program, what's the population they serve, what's their community needs like, so that you're familiar with how you might fit within that mission. You should be aware of any special programming that the university or the program has to offer. Do they have special research programs or particular clinical sites that they might work with? Is there a patient or community population that's highly served by that university? Where might they do their clinical rotations at? Do they have any affiliated hospitals or other agencies that they partner with? This information might be helpful to you in formulating the questions that you will be asking your interviewer at the end of your interview. And we'll get to that. But most admissions committees give the interviewee an opportunity to ask the interview committee a question or questions. And this information, familiarizing yourself with the program and the university, can help you potentially formulate some questions that you might want to ask to your admissions committee. Again, I think this information is helpful if you would have done this prior to applying, so you knew exactly why you were applying to a program. But at this point, it's good to familiarize yourself with the program so that you can formulate well thought out questions. So now we're going to talk a little bit about interview formats. And we talked a little bit about this before we started, but there's different types of interviews. And it's really critically important that before you go into an interview, you know what type of interview you're walking into, okay? So if you have a group interview, you don't want to have the expectation that you're doing a traditional interview. Or if you think you're going to do a traditional interview and you show up and it's an MMI, that could really be rattling to you and affect your success in an interview. Generally, there's 3 types of interviews. The most common is a traditional interview, and this is where an interviewee is going to be meeting with several members of the admissions committee. Generally, it's like a one-on-one or a one-on-3, where you might be meeting with the faculty, a staff, and a student. Okay, so that's what we would call a traditional interview. And you as the interviewee, you would be the only person in the room at that time. So it's kind of a one-on-one interview. A group interview, which some of you have mentioned that you have, is where a small group of interviewees meets with generally one member of the admissions committee. And that's a little bit more challenging because the same question is asked and then everybody that's there to interview has an opportunity to respond to the question. Lastly, we have MMI, and this is analogous to, a lot of people call it speed dating for interviewing. I'm not sure if anybody knows that analogy, but a lot of people, that's kind of what they equate it to. It's an opportunity for the interviewee to rotate through multiple stations and respond to a question or scenario at each station. And so it's something where you're rotating through. In addition to traditional group and MMI, you might experience a closed or blinded interview, and this is where the interviewer has not seen any part of your application. They don't know your GPA, they don't know your standardized exam scores, they don't know your resume, they don't know your letters. The only thing that they know is that you've been extended an interview. So that might change the way that you respond to some of your questions. You might also see a partially closed or blinded interview, and this is where the interviewer sees part of your application. I would say here it's probably where they see your letters and your essays, but not necessarily your academic metrics like your GPA and your standardized exam scores. And so knowing that might change the way you respond to interview questions. And then lastly is a completely open interview. And this is where the interviewer has read every aspect of your application and likely has it with them at the time that they might interview you. It might be on their desk throughout the interview. If this information wasn't provided to you when you were extended an interview offer, it is absolutely okay for you to follow up with the institution and ask them what type of interview you are going to be receiving at that school. So they should generally provide you whether it's going to be traditional group or MMI, and then if it's going to be closed, partially closed, or open. So if any of you have interviews and you're not sure of that information, I would recommend that you follow up and inquire, because it does affect how you will prepare for your interview. So how do you prepare for an interview? Now that you know a little bit what to expect, how do you prepare for an interview? So first we're going to start with MMI, because I think that's the one that causes most worry to students. It's a newer model. MMI has been around for maybe 5 or 6 years, so it's relatively new in terms of an interviewing model, but it's growing rapidly. It was when it started in Canada, and it was initially used only solely within medical schools, and now other professional programs are starting to pick it up. Dental schools use MMI, pharmacy schools use MMI. I think PA schools are starting to use MMI. So it's starting to filter into other health professions. So it is good to be aware of what MMI is and how you might prepare for it. So again, it's multiple mini interviews, and it's your opportunity to rotate through stations and interact with different interviewers, generally somewhere between 8 and 10 stations. MMI is particularly good at assessing how a student thinks through something, because it's usually some type of scenario or problem that you're presented with, and it shows the admissions committee how you might think through this challenging problem. It's also going to show to them how you communicate, particularly in your verbal communication, body language, so nonverbal cues, how you formulate ideas. So are you really able to see holistically what might be going on in this situation and understand that there's a lot of gray in the world, and it's not necessarily black and white, and there might be multiple perspectives that are valuable in this situation. It might show some problem solving skills, so creative thinking and problem solving. For ethical questions, you might be able to demonstrate cultural competencies and other interpersonal skills like compassion, professionalism, ethics, and integrity. And then lastly, it shows that you're thoughtful about things that might be going on in the world outside of what your bubble as an undergraduate student are. Generally, MMI is a means of assessing qualities that are difficult to evaluate through quantitative measurements like GPAs and standardized exam scores. And that's really true of all interviews. Again, these are assessing personal characteristics that it's very difficult to evaluate on paper. So what will you be asked in an MMI? What does an MMI actually look like? And in an MMI, again, you're going to be rotating through stations. So think of a long hallway where there's 8 to 12 rooms. On the door of each room, there's going to be a prompt or a scenario. You generally have a few minutes. I would say usually you have 2 minutes to read the prompt that's on the door. And most programs will let you take a notepad to make any notes that you might want to have about your response. If there's some bullet points that you want to make sure to touch on during your response, you can jot them down. At the end of the 2 minutes, you'll enter the room, and that's where your interviewer will be. You'll introduce yourself to the interviewer, sit down, and then you'll respond and have a dialogue about the question, scenario, or problem that's been presented. That dialogue will last anywhere from 6 to 8 minutes. Typically, it's 2 minutes to read, 8 minutes to respond, where you'll have the opportunity to respond with the interviewer. Now, let me reassess your fears here. You're not going to talk straight for 8 minutes. Okay, I get that fear a lot from students. They think they're going to read a scenario for 2 minutes, walk into a room, and be expected to talk nonstop for 8 minutes. We don't expect that. They don't expect that. The interviewer will have follow-up questions. They'll have probing questions. It will be a dialogue where you're going to interact with the interviewer. So you'll likely respond to the initial scenario that might take a few minutes, and then they'll ask you follow-up questions, which will take the remainder of the time. At the end of your 8 minutes, a bell rings. You get up and you move to the next station, and you do it all over again. In a scenario where you might have 12 stations, 2 of those might be rest stations. So you might do 4 stations and get a break, and then continue on, do more stations and get a break. Things that you might get asked in an MMI, they vary. Generally with MMI, you sign a confidentiality clause with the institution that you are not able to release the questions, or share the questions, I should say, share the questions with other prospective applicants or share the questions on social media or message boards. That's the word I'm thinking for. You're not going to be able to share the questions on message boards, social media, or with other prospective applicants. So generally you sign a confidentiality clause. So I can't necessarily tell you exactly what gets asked in an MMI because that information is confidential and it can't be shared with me. But in general, you'll likely see some of these types of questions or scenarios asked in an MMI. You might have an ethical situation or something about a policy or social issue, maybe about physician-assisted suicide or the Right to Die Act, or maybe an ethical dilemma like you saw your classmate cheating on a test. You might be asked to interact with an actor. So maybe you enter the room and there's somebody there who is supposed to be your peer or colleague who's afraid to give a presentation, and your job is to calm them down, make them feel confident, motivated, and supported to move them forward. You might be asked a standard or quote unquote traditional interview question like, why do you want to be a physician? Or tell me about yourself. You might be asked to do a teamwork-based task. So something where you're responsible for giving directions to another person, which is common for dental interviews. You might be asked to do a writing sample or writing assignment, which is very common for pharmacy interviews. Generally, pharmacy interviews have an on-site writing sample where you might have 2 30-minute essays, and that information is generally compared to what was written in your personal statement and primary and secondary applications. And then, like I said at the beginning, you might have a rest station. So, responding for 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and 10 minutes can get exhausting, so they might give you a rest station to give yourself a 10-minute break before you continue the rest of MMI. So last slide on MMI is how does one necessarily prepare for MMI? And there really isn't the best way because the questions can be so broad and they can just be on everyday things that happen in life and how you might problem solve through that. So they're generally not on any specific knowledge that you have to prepare for in advance. But being familiar with the model, being familiar with what is expected of you at an MMI can really be helpful. So you'll know how many minutes you have to read the scenario, how many minutes you have to respond, how many stations you're going to be rotating through. Kind of having an idea of what to expect can be helpful. But truthfully, because questions can be about anything, there really isn't any specific knowledge that you need to have in order to be successful through MMI. I get this question a lot. What am I supposed to say? How do I give them the right answer? And with most interview questions, you're going to hear me say there really isn't a right answer because the world doesn't exist in black or white, right? The world doesn't exist in something that's completely right or completely wrong. The world exists in a lot of gray, and the world exists in there's multiple perspectives and there's validity in those perspectives. So I can't say that given an MMI, even if it's an ethical question, that there's absolutely 100% right way to respond. You have to respond in the way that you would respond. It's about how you think through the problem, not necessarily what you think. So can you see that there's gray areas? Can you see that there might be multiple perspectives? Can you understand that there's validity in both of those perspectives? Or maybe are you at a point in your developmental progress that you can see, nope, only my way is the right way, I'm right, and anybody who thinks different than me is wrong. That's going to be a challenging perspective to argue through an MMI because most of the questions that you're going to get in an MMI, 2 different people might have 2 completely different opinions about that. And it's okay to understand that's okay. It doesn't have to be clearly right or clearly wrong. There are multiple perspectives that are all valid. So again, formulate multiple perspectives when responding to ethical questions. And then lastly, the one thing I would add to this is students worry a lot about legality, particularly in ethical questions, is do I need to know what's legal or what's not legal? And should I bring that up in my response? To that, I would say no, because at this point, you're not a physician, you're not a dentist or a nurse or a PA or anything that you might be interested in. You're still an undergraduate student. You haven't been accepted to a professional program yet. So I don't think there's an expectation that you know what's legal within your profession or you know what's legal in your state. So we're going to talk a little bit in a slide or two a little bit more about ethical type questions and how is best to respond to an ethical type question without talking too much about what you think is legal or not. Because even if you read every website and all of these different laws, you're not a healthcare provider. So you really don't know what's legal for your state or your profession. So lastly about MMI, I get this question a lot. Why? Why does there have to be a new way to do this? Why do we have to do MMI? Can't we just do traditional interviews? And with everything in life, there's pros and cons. There's definitely pros to doing MMI. There's cons to doing MMI. But they've done a lot of research about MMI interviews, and they really are a good predictor of what your future clinical performance will be. I mean, this started out within medical students, so this is particularly among medical students. You have 2 minutes to read a scenario, and you have 8 minutes to respond, maybe 10 minutes to respond. That means you have 10 minutes to learn the information you need, connect with another person, make a conclusion, and move forward, right? Does that sound like a clinical interaction to you guys? You have an opportunity to come in, review the patient's chart, come in, take a patient history, listen to the chief complaint, do an evaluation, make a diagnosis, and move forward, okay? In a lot of philosophical way, MMI mocks what your clinical evaluation will be with patients. So it really is a good judge of what you might do in interacting with patients in the future, particularly with how are you able to connect with a patient? Are you able to talk through difficult scenarios and still be compassionate and empathetic? Can you communicate and be articulate? That's again something that we can't evaluate on paper, but it can be evaluated in personal interactions. The other reason MMI can be helpful is that you have multiple interviewers, right? So generally interviews are never perfect. So if you run into a question or scenario that you struggle with, or an interviewer that you don't connect well with, you still have multiple opportunities to still do well in the interview. Where if your interview is just with one person, your fate relies on just that one interaction. So it does give you opportunity, if you do struggle in a station, to still be able to kind of pick yourself up and dust yourself off and move forward and be successful with your remaining 8 stations. The downside of MMI is there is research that also shows it favors more extroverted applicants because you do have to have very quick interactions, and sometimes introverted people or introverted applicants take a little bit longer to warm up to really anybody. So there is a little bit of research that says that it favors extroverted applicants over introverted applicants just by the nature of the personality. But overall, it does give a more unbiased evaluation of the applicant because there's multiple people who are evaluating the applicant. Questions? So who is willing to read this sample question for me?
An answer or just read?
Just read.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris.
Universities are commonly faced with the complicated task of balancing the educational needs of their students and the cost required to provide learning resources to a large number of individuals. As a result of this tension, there has been much debate regarding the optimal size of classes. One side argues that smaller classes provide a more educationally effective setting for students, while others argue that it makes no difference. So larger classes should be used to minimize the number of instructors required.
And then discuss your opinion and the issue with the interviewer. So this is a sample MMI question that's used. It was published in an article in 2004. So this gives you an idea of something that they're asking. And this is something that you guys have all dealt with at a UC school, right? You've all been involved in growing class sizes to accommodate the amount of students. So this question is really asking, what are the pros and cons of that? In one essence, we can serve more students, and in the other essence, you're not able to connect with somebody as much because the class size is 400 or 500 students, right? So it's really just taking the opportunity to kind of digest this with your interviewer and say, well, I see pros and cons to both sides of this. Here's what one perspective might be, here's what another perspective might be, and then be able to provide your opinion on what you might think is best. But the key is to really validate that there's two different perspectives here that both are valid because they're coming from different values. And to understand that really shows a global way of thinking to an interviewer. Another question, due to the shortage of physicians in underserved rural areas, it's been suggested that medical programs preferentially admit students who are willing to commit to a 2 or 3 year tenure in such an area upon graduation. Consider the broad implications of this policy for health and healthcare cost. For example, do you think this approach will be effective? At what expense? Discuss with your interviewer. Again, so this is kind of driven at mission fit institutions. So schools that say, we preferentially look at students who want to serve in underserved communities or rural communities or want to do a certain type of healthcare. Is it right for a school to preferentially admit somebody based on the needs of their community? And there's pros and cons to that answer. And really the key to being able to approach these questions is to understand globally that there's two sides of this. There's the service to the institution, the service to the community, the service to the students. How do all of these things intersect to best support the needs of everybody? So it really is a way of showing global thinking to an admissions committee, not necessarily that there's clearly a black or white, right or wrong answer. Because I think if we had more time, we as a group could get together and we could probably spend an hour talking about this. You know, each one of us might have a different opinion or a different experience, a past or present experience based on this. We might know somebody that this has affected, and that might affect how we think about these situations. So it's really having a global conversation, a holistic conversation with your interviewer to show that you understand there's multiple perspectives going on here. So there's other sample interview questions that I provided in the back of the room if anybody was able to pick that up. We have a lot of other sample questions that we provided to you. I'm not going to go through all of them now because there's probably 30 or so. We're going to go through a few of them. The first one I think that stresses students out the most, and is probably true of most people here today, is being asked, so why do you want to be a physician, a dentist, a pharmacist, a nurse, a veterinarian, whatever that might be? A lot of students get stressed about that question, right? The first tip that I'll give you in answering this question is please don't say, I want to help people. That can somewhere be included in your response, but it should not be the only part of your response. I don't want you to say so why do you want to be a pharmacist? Because I want to help people. Or even worse, ever since I was a little boy or a little girl, I knew I wanted to be a pharmacist because I want to help people. I think that gets to the spirit a lot of what the answer to this question is, but it's a very superficial way of thinking about why you're committing the rest of your life to this professional program. Instead, be aware that you've really already answered this question. Those of you who have already applied to a professional program, you have already written a personal statement that was anywhere from a page to a page and a half about why you want to be a physician, a dentist, a pharmacist, a physical therapist, an optometrist, so on and so forth. You've really already had a chance to articulate the answer to this question in writing. And the key in an interview is to really summarize what you wrote in your personal statement in your interview. You really don't need to provide a different answer to this question than you already provided. You really need to be providing the same answer that you already gave in writing, but being able to articulate that now verbally, okay? They're really looking for, why is it that this is the right profession? Like I'll use medicine, for example. Why do you want to be a physician and not a PA? Or why do you want to be a dentist and not a pharmacist? Like really, why is this profession the right profession for you? So if you've already successfully written a personal statement, which I imagine you've done because you've been offered an interview, summarizing that personal statement in 3 or 4 minutes will be a sufficient answer to this question. Okay. The other really challenging question that I get from students is being so afraid of being asked, so tell me about yourself, right? And this might be the very first question that you get in an interview. And this question can be Pandora's box. What do you say? Do you say too much? Do you say too little? How do you approach this question? Asking somebody, tell me about yourself. I've unfortunately seen the answer to this question go on for 15 minutes because they're not really sure that self-censorship of where do I start? Where do I stop? What do I say? And so you kind of have what I call word vomit, and just everything about your life story comes out and tell me about yourself. Please don't do that. Really try to focus in on what this question is asking, and that's just give me some highlights about yourself. If this is an open interview, an open file interview, and they already know your GPA and your standardized exam scores and where you did your undergraduate experience and all of the extracurricular activities you've been involved in, I would want you to highlight more things about yourself. Maybe where were you born and raised? Are you family oriented? What types of things do you do for fun? You are a person outside of being pre-med or pre-den or pre-pharm or pre-optometry. You have likes and dislikes. You have things that you like to do for fun, ways that you like to relax. If you're really into rock climbing, or you're a dog breeder, or you're a foodie, that's all fine to say. Really share with the admissions committee some things about you that really you feel define you. If it's a closed interview and they don't know anything about you, you might want to direct this question more along the lines of some things that you had done as an undergraduate student. Maybe some highlights of extracurricular activities that you've been involved in, as well as some things that are really personal about yourself. Just where were you born and raised? Are you family oriented? Are you involved out in your community? Just some things that they might not necessarily know if it's a closed file interview. The one thing I say, this should be a 2 to 3 minute response. No more than that. Please don't let this question be Pandora's box where you talk for so long that you don't actually get to any other interview questions. And I've had students come back and say, we got through 2 questions because the first question I took so long to answer and it was only a 20-minute interview, we only had time for one other question. Another question you might be prepared for is, what are you going to do if you're not admitted to whatever professional program this year? This is a common question near the end of an interview, and it's a common question regardless of how competitive a student is. And when I have very competitive students with very high GPAs and very strong standardized exam scores, this question makes them very nervous. And I've had students come back and say when they were asked that question, they may have said, what do you mean I'm not going to get accepted? I've worked very hard to ensure I'm going to get accepted. And so this is really more of the admissions committee evaluating, have you had a plan? Are you doing things in your glide year to strengthen your application in case you do have to reapply? Applying to professional programs, as the first slide showed, are very competitive. There are competitive applicants every year who don't get accepted. So in this question, if you say, yes, I obtained a job as a scribe or a dental assistant or a farm tech. I'm taking more classes. I'm shadowing more. I'm getting more leadership experience, and I will be applying in the following cycle. Okay, so you want to let them know what are you doing to strengthen your application and that you will be reapplying. It's very important to say, and I will be reapplying, just so there's no question about it. But very importantly, if you say you're going to do certain things, do them. Okay, don't tell an admissions committee, oh, I'm going to get a farm tech license, or I'm taking post-bac classes, or I'm going to retake this standardized exam. Don't say it if you're not going to follow through and do it. Okay, so you should have a plan of what you're doing in your glide year to strengthen your application and be able to convey that to a committee. You might also be asked, why is USC or UCSF or UCR, why is this the right fit for you? Why is this the right school for you? I guarantee you've already been asked this question in a secondary or supplemental application. Almost every supplemental application is going to ask why X, Y, or Z school. So it's a question you've already been asked. And again, you should basically be summarizing what you already wrote in your secondary or supplemental application about why you're interested in that school. What about their mission or what about their special programming is of interest to you? because clearly it's not just about being a dentist or a pharmacist at this point. It's about why USC School of Dentistry or UCSF School of Pharmacy is the right fit as opposed to Western or Roseman. What will you contribute to this class if you're admitted? And this is, I think, difficult for students because a lot of my students don't really recognize what they bring to the table. They don't recognize all of the awesome skill sets and characteristics that they do actually possess. A lot of students really sell themselves short. So really think about what has been unique about your path. Maybe growing up in a diverse community or attending a diverse institution. Or maybe if you have a clinical license, if you work as a certified nurse's assistant or a dental assistant, those things are relatively uncommon in an application. If you've had a lot of paid employment as an undergraduate, those might be some skill sets that you bring to the table that would be beneficial to a professional program. Maybe leadership skills or team working skills. So really think about the types of things that you've been involved in college. What skill sets did you develop from those experiences that might be unique to you and that might be good contributing factors to a professional program? And then lastly, some programs might ask you, like, what's your problem solving skills like, or what is your process for making decisions? They want to understand a little bit maybe about how you manage time or how you prioritize tasks, how you problem solve, or how you think critically or creatively. So there's a lot of ways to frame this question. How do you problem solve? How do you make decisions? Or maybe what if this specific scenario happened? What would you do? But again, these are traditional interview questions. So this is a way for them to assess what's your thought process going to be like when issues inevitably happen, right? Life is life. Life is not perfect. You will always run into issues. So what's going to happen when a problem does arise? How will you navigate that problem? A couple more sample interview questions. You might get asked some things that are quote unquote non-academic, like what was the last book you read that was not required for school? What do you do to relax or have fun? This, I think, is a really tricky question for pre-health students because almost all of them want to say, I do research, or I read scholarly textbooks, or I watch documentaries. And maybe in part that's true, but you're also a person. You have to do things to de-stress and relax. Some people that's exercising, some people that's watching movies, some people that's social interactions, some people it's going to fancy dinners. Sometimes it's video gaming. Everybody does something different to relax. And yes, some of those things might be scholarly and some of those things might be social and fun. And it's absolutely okay to show that you're a person in addition to a student, okay? And really say, these are the types of things that help me de-stress. Everybody has something. It's okay to share that. Be open sharing that. And then lastly, this one I've heard such funny answers to along my years of doing this, but this is a common interview question. Tell me about a time that you failed in something that you learned from that experience. In one instance, I had a student that said, oh, I've worked very hard to ensure that I've never failed or made a mistake. And that's just not life, right? That's not reality. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm sure half of the people here today made a mistake less than an hour ago, right? We're human, we're imperfect. Everybody has failed at one time or another. But it really shows a lot of self-reflection and self-evaluation. If you can identify a mistake or an issue that you made, how you corrected it, and what did you learn from it moving forward. Questions about ethical issues, I think, create the most anxiety because really it's hard to say what you might be asked. You might be asked questions about healthcare reform, informed consent, birth control, abortion, stem cell research, physician-assisted suicide, or like the Right to Die Act was just approved in California. You might be asked about research, whether that's on animals or humans, stem cells, organ donation. I'm sure there's a lot more, but that's all I could come up with on the slide. So really with ethical questions, it's hard to say exactly what you might be asked. You might get an ethical question in a group interview or a traditional interview. So even if you have a traditional interview that might include 10 or 12 questions, one of those could absolutely be an ethical question. If you have an MMI, probably multiple of them will be kind of scenario ethical type questions. So how do you respond to an ethical question? There's no perfect answer to this, but these are hopefully some tips that will be helpful to you. Again, understanding that this isn't black and white and there really is no absolute right or wrong answer because everybody's going to have different opinions. I feel like acknowledging both sides of the issue can be helpful in formulating your response. To really acknowledge and validate that one person might think one way and another person might think another way, or in this situation there's multiple constituents that have differing opinions, that can be helpful. It really shows that you're aware, again, that life is in shades of gray and it's not clearly black and white. It shows that you're reflective and thoughtful so that you can see maybe past your own experience or your own biases. It also shows that you're going to be open-minded when you work with patients in the future. Because remember, patients come first. So although you might have a particular opinion based on your morals, your ethics, your history, and your experience, to be open-minded to understand that maybe the patient you're working with doesn't share those same morals, values, or experiences. If you don't know about a topic, you literally have no idea what the interviewer is asking you, I would recommend admitting that and try to demonstrate your willingness to learn more. I think one of the worst things that you can do in an interview or when you're talking to somebody is pretend you know about something that you don't know about. Okay, so if they're really asking you a very specific question, which I think is unlikely, but if you're really being asked a question that's far outside of your knowledge base, provide maybe the information that you do know, but admit that you need to learn more about that topic. You are not expected to know every minute detail, every minute nuance, technical language, or particularly what's legal about everything in the world, okay? You should have some working knowledge of what's going on in the world around you. So if you're not watching the news or keeping up on current events, probably you might want to do that. I think that's my next slide. But you're not expected to know every policy and every law about every issue in the world. Right? That's not what they're going to be asking you. They're going to be more asking you about, what do you think about this issue? How can we support patients better? Because really, it's the patient first. If you can keep the focus on the patient, what can you do to best support the needs of the patient? That can be a very successful approach to answering ethical questions. Again, you will absolutely have personal histories and experiences that may bias your response, but you don't want that to change the care that you would provide to a patient. Patient first, patient first. And then when struggling to think of how you might move this patient forward, having referrals is helpful. You know, as a healthcare provider, a physician, a dentist, or a pharmacist, you work in team-based approach to care. So if a patient needs something that you're not able to provide, who might you be able to refer that patient to so they are able to get the resources to have the care that they need to be healthy and happy? So I would say keep the focus on the patient and make referrals and try to reduce your own personal bias and understand globally and holistically that there might be multiple things at play here. Hopefully those are some successful strategies on how to approach ethical type questions. And if you want to know more about how to prepare for these, really reading, be aware of what's going on in the world around you. New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, New Yorker, those are really common magazine publications. Be familiar with, again, current events, social media policies. Watching global, national, and local news can be helpful. The AAMC, the ADA, the AACP, Go Dental, ASCO, I think that covers everybody that's here. Those are all really good resources to know maybe what's the hot topic in your profession. And then lastly, be open-minded. Don't be so closed-minded to think that your way is the right way and your way is the only way, because that's not true of anything in life. So as hard as it is to believe, your interview is an opportunity. This is not, you're not going to be grilled They're not going to flash a flashlight in your face and scare you to the point where you're so petrified you can't respond. This is honestly going to be a genuine conversation between you and an interviewer. And most of your interviewers are going to be clinical faculty. And as you know, clinicians are very warm and genuine people because they do have to make connections with other people. So I think you will find once you get through your interview, it's a much more positive experience that you might be anticipating. A lot of students really anticipate a lot of negativity through an interview. They think they're going to try to be tricked and tripped up so that they can weed you out. But again, this is an opportunity to showcase all of the wonderful things they've already seen from you on paper and that you are genuinely that person in reality, in person. So be prepared to discuss. Be prepared to have a conversation. Your interviewer might ask you anything. Your interviewer might completely go off script and find something that they love about you as a person or your application and talk to you about that. I had a student one year who she was a dancer. So her degree wasn't in dance, but she really loved to dance. And that resonated with one of her interviewers, and they spent 90% of the time of her interview talking about dance. So they didn't talk about her application, her interest in a health profession, her extracurricular activities. They connected about something, and that's what they talked about. So can't ever guarantee that your interviewer is going to stick to their script because they just might find something really unique and interesting about your application and talk to you about that.
Is that a good thing? Hopefully.
I mean, it's a great way to connect with an interviewer for sure. I mean, in that case it was. The student got accepted to that medical school, but it was a very positive experience. It was something that the interviewer was very interested in, and they just had a really great dialogue about that. I've had students come back that said, I was an Eagle Scout and so was my interviewer, and we talked about scouting the whole time. Or I had a student who was a farmer and they talked about farming and farm life. So I can't say that happens a lot, but every year or so I have a student come back and say, we didn't talk about anything that I prepared for. We really talked more about something that was really specific and personal to my application. If you're not sure what to say, I think students have this a lot, like not wanting to pause, right? When you're in the moment in an interview, if you take 2 seconds or 3 seconds to pause before responding, or pause between transitioning to thoughts, to the interviewee, that feels like a lifetime. When you just take 2 seconds to pause, I think the interviewee really feels like it's awkward, and the interviewer is going to think that you're socially awkward in some way. But really taking a natural pause to collect your thoughts and have a well-articulated response can be helpful to you. If you feel that just pausing would be awkward for you, you could always say, let me take a moment to think about that. It's okay to take a moment to respond. Now, if you're quiet for 10 seconds, that might be a little bit awkward, but a 2 to 3 second pause is going to feel a lot longer to you than it will to the interviewer. So do take a moment if you need to collect your thoughts before responding to a question, because you only get one chance to respond. Okay. And again, if you don't know an answer to a question or you're not sure about something, I would discourage you from trying to make something up that sounds good. Do share what you do know. Do share what your experiences have been, but it's okay to say, that's as much as I know about this topic. I'm definitely going to learn more about that, or I'll have these resources to help me learn more about that, and to not talk yourself into a hole about something that you're really not sure about. Or maybe even ask for clarification. So if you need clarification on a question, maybe ask for that. So on the interview day, what happens when you get there? So this has all been about preparation, but when you get there, now this all has to be put into practice. Definitely planning ahead. I mean, you guys are planning ahead by attending this interview workshop, so that's good. I would also recommend for your interview, you plan to arrive the day before, particularly if you're traveling for an interview, because lots of things can go wrong, right? Your plane can be late taking off, or there's no rental cars available, or you miss your bus, or you have no idea where the building is. It's what can go wrong will go wrong, the saying goes, right? So check ahead before if there's housing available. So this, again, if you have to travel for an interview, are there any current students who are willing to offer housing? If they are willing and they're offering, take them up on it. They definitely mean it. They might walk you down to your interview the day before. They might take you to dinner the night before, help you prep for the interview. So there generally is a network of current students at the school who might be willing to house interviewees as they come in. Definitely, I can't stress this enough, know where you need to go, right? If you're interviewing at UCR, you already know UCR. That's great. But if you're interviewing literally anywhere else, you probably don't go to that school very often. You're going to USC or Western or Roseman or St. Joseph's or UCSF. The likelihood that you've actually been to that campus is probably pretty small. So going ahead of time and doing what I call like a dry run, where are you going to park? Where's the building at? How long is it going to take you to get there? Are you accounting for traffic? You do not want to be late to an interview. So kind of do a dry run beforehand so you know exactly how you're going to get there. You know where you're going to park. You know where the building is. You know exactly where you need to check in. That morning of your interview, that will reduce a lot of stress. If the morning of your interview, you're trying to get on Google Maps to figure out how you're going to get to downtown LA to get to USC, and you didn't think about how bad traffic was going to be going from Riverside to LA, you might even miss your interview. Okay, so really do a lot of planning ahead. I recommend bringing some type of like folder or portfolio with you to not only bring a copy of your application, you probably won't need it, but the Boy Scout motto is be prepared, right? So I like to be prepared just in case. Obviously bring a pen or a pencil. As overlooked as that is, you might need to take notes throughout your interview day because there is generally a lot of programming that you're going to attend, and you might want to have some questions ready. So it's good to be prepared with like a notepad, a copy of your application, some professional materials to carry with you the day of your interview. So what happens on an interview day? I can't guarantee this is true of all schools, but most schools will probably have some type of welcome session from the dean. They'll probably give you an overview of the school, the program. They'll talk about the mission statement, the extracurricular activities, special programming. You'll definitely get some financial aid information. Financial aid information is really important in you making a decision about where you're going to attend. How am I going to pay for this? It's going to be $200,000. Where's the money going to come from? Usually get lunch and a campus tour. So ladies, make sure you wear footwear that you're going to be able to walk around a campus in. For pharmacy, they have a writing sample. For dental, a lot of times you have a group activity, and then you're going to have your interview, whether that's a group interview, an MMI interview, or a traditional interview. So you're going to do some heavy programming prior to your interview, and that's where taking notes is going to come into play. If you have multiple interviews or you have multiple acceptances, all of the schools start to blend together. So taking notes about your experiences at the school can help you make an informed decision later about what institution you actually want to accept your acceptance at. If you only have one acceptance or one interview, that makes it easy, right? One's technically all you need, but if you have one, that makes it easy. When you have multiple, when I have students that start interviewing at 4, 5, 6 plus schools, they start to forget what happened at NYU, Columbia, UCR, and UCLA. They're like, oh, I'm forgetting what my experience was. So taking some notes about these things can be helpful. This, I think, goes without saying. You need to dress professionally. Professional programs are still very conservative programs. I would recommend a suit. For both men and women, a pantsuit. Women, if you feel more comfortable in a skirt or a dress type suit, that's fine as long as you feel comfortable in that. If you primarily wear pants to your interview. If you primarily wear skirts, long skirts past the fingertips or the knees, then wear a skirt. It's really about what you feel comfortable in. An interview is always a new experience. It's always kind of a nerve-wracking experience. So you don't want to feel even more uncomfortable in the clothing that you wear. You want to wear something that you feel comfortable in. Men, it's a little bit easier, right? You're going to wear a pantsuit. You have to wear a tie. I don't think anybody here is going to try not to wear a tie. Long sleeve shirt, dress shirt, button-up shirt, tie, matching suit. Belt, nice shoes. For women, wear whatever shoes you feel comfortable walking around a campus in. So don't wear a brand new pair of shoes that you've never worn before because you might regret that by the end of the day. Be clean, be polished, be professional. It's really not that challenging. A lot of students put so much more effort into what they're going to wear the day of the interview, and probably you and your mom are the only two people that will ever notice. Do I wear a white shirt or a blue shirt? Do I wear a red tie or a purple tie? It doesn't matter. Be clean, be polished, be professional. Okay, that's my rule there. And then when you're traveling, for those of you who said you're going to New York or you're going outside of the state of California, it's October and it's snowing in other parts of the country already. It does not generally snow here, and it's 95 degrees outside in the middle of October. So it's pretty warm, but that's not true across the country. So if you're traveling to Colorado, Washington, the East Coast, be aware that it gets very cold there. Gloves, scarves, rain shoes, umbrellas, make sure that you're kind of checking what weather you might be in for. Us Californians, we don't do so good with weather, so be looking out for that. Asking questions. Again, I think this is the 8th time I've said this in this presentation. There's no right question to ask. Students sometimes come in and they ask me, what should I be asking to an interviewer? And I'll say, I don't know, I'm not the one interviewing. You want to ask questions that you genuinely have to your interviewer. So there's no right questions. I think there's some things that you can avoid doing. I would avoid asking things that are clearly stated on the school's website. Okay, so if they've told you what their mission statement is, if they've told you how big their class size is, if they've told you how many faculty they have, probably those would not be questions to ask, because your interviewer might just say it's on the website, right? And that's probably not a response you want to get from an interviewer. You want them to be meaningful questions. I would avoid asking about when you'll know about admissions. They probably will already disclose that to you at some point, what their process or procedure is going to be moving forward. But I would also avoid asking about like the prestige of the program or board pass rates. Board pass rates are something that you can inquire about when you've been offered an acceptance. But if you haven't been offered an acceptance yet, it's not really relevant information. So it's something that you can do once you've been accepted, then you can start evaluating more specific factors about the school. But at the time that you're interviewing, that's kind of irrelevant information. This is me personally. I would really avoid you asking questions to your interviewer about their experience. For example, asking the dean why they chose medicine, dentistry, or optometry, or asking them, why should I come to this school? Or what do you like about working at Marshall Ketchum? The focus of an interview really is on you as the interviewee. So I think it kind of shifts the focus when you start asking the interviewer questions about themselves or you ask them to sell their program. So keep the focus on you. Ask questions that you have genuinely about a program. Okay? If you want to know more questions about special programming that they have, their curriculum model, clinical sites, just research programs, mentorships. Professional programs have all different types of student support services. If you have questions about what they have to offer, those are some things that you might genuinely want to ask. If you don't have any questions, don't ask any questions. So if you really feel like throughout your interview day that all of your questions have been answered, because again, you're going to do a welcome session, a campus tour, a financial aid presentation. If throughout all of the programming during the day your questions have been answered, it's okay to say, I had questions, but they've been answered by all of the programming that I've attended throughout the day, right? I had questions, but your staff did a wonderful job of already addressing all those questions. So really, whenever you ask a question, it should be genuinely a question you have, not something that's on the website. When am I going to know when I get accepted? Or how big is your class? Or how many people have you interviewed? Ask questions that are meaningful for you to make a selection about your school. All right, last couple things here. Like I was saying before, I think it's helpful to make notes after your interview, because if you are lucky enough to have multiple interviews start to mesh together. And you start to kind of maybe get confused about what special program might be available at one school versus another school. So making notes can be helpful. The curriculum, what type of curriculum do they offer? How are classes graded? Are they pass-fail or do you get a grade? Where do you do your clinical rotations? Do students seem happy? What type What types of things did the faculty do? Were the facilities new? Do they have great technology? What is your overall impression of the school? These are schools that you're going to spend years at. Most of these schools you're going to spend 4 years there, right? You're going to pay these schools hundreds of thousands of dollars, and until the day that you retire from your professional your professional career, you're going to carry that school's name and reputation with you, right? It's going to be hanging on your wall, and patients are going to ask you, where'd you go to medical school? Where'd you go to dental school? Where'd you go to pharmacy school? It has to be a school that you connect with. It has to be a school that provides you what you need as a student to be successful, okay? So I really want you guys to see this as an opportunity that you want to go to the right school for you, not that you want to beg somebody to accept you, which I know is hard to do right now. But as you start going through these interviews, you're going to see that every program's a little bit different, and you're going to want to lean towards the program that provides you the special services, the support that you need as a student. And that, believe it or not, might take you outside of the state of California. Okay, that's really hard for Californians to accept leaving the state of California, because Californians think that California is a country and you can't leave unless you have a passport and you can never come back. And that's just not the case. And I have absolutely had students interview in California and interview in New York, in Colorado, Boston, in Florida, and come back and say, you know what, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I'm going to CU Denver, because I really felt so much more at home there than I did at a California school. And that's okay, because these are national licenses and you can practice anywhere. There's no connection to where you go to school and where you end up practicing. It's well, I guess this is for medicine. It's where you do residency. Where you do your residency is where you end up practicing. But for dental, if you're going to go on and do a specialty, or pharmacy, you're going to go on and do a residency, or medicine, you're required to do residency. It's where you do those subspecialties that generally are linked to where you're going to plant your roots. Okay, so be open to applying and interviewing outside of the state of California, because you never know that you might like it better there. A professional courtesy is to send a thank you email or something at the end of your interview, some type of thank you email or thank you note. Most institutions do see this as a nice gesture. It's probably unlikely you're going to get the name of everybody that you come into contact with that day, but if you're able to get the name of somebody, the admissions representative, you can send them an email and ask that it be shared with other members of the admissions committee. So this is a professional courtesy. It is a nice gesture, unless the school specifically says, do not send us a thank you email. And some schools will say that. Some schools will be transparent and say, we know that you are very grateful for this opportunity. We know you're thankful. It's okay, you don't have to follow up. But that's few and far between. Most schools will see this as a professional courtesy. After, again, interviewing, acceptances, your guess is as good as mine. They can come at any point in time, and this is where the wait can become kind of painful. I know it's already painful waiting for an interview, but when you've had an interview and then you don't know if you've been accepted, rejected, waitlisted, or put on an alternate list, you just keep obsessively checking your email. So sometimes, like optometry schools, they generally can be really good within about 2 weeks. They usually let you know whether you've been accepted, rejected, or waitlisted. Other professional programs, they can come when they come. I've had students interview in October and not get accepted until April. And that's kind of extreme, but it happens. Most programs have a May 15th deadline, so that's a good benchmark to know, okay, if I haven't gotten any interviews by like April, May, I'm probably not going to get any. Or if I haven't been accepted to any schools by May, you might not be. If you've been put on a wait list by May, that's okay. You can still be pulled off the wait list well into June, okay? So kind of in a sense, no news is good news. You're never completely done until you have rejections, okay? So if you've been rejected, you know your application's not going to move forward. But if you've had an interview and they haven't said yes or no, then your application's still under consideration. Dental is a little bit different. The first release date for dental is, I think this year, December 3rd. It's usually the first couple days in December. So anybody that's been interviewed before that, They might know about acceptances early December, but if you are interviewed in October, November, and you don't hear anything at the beginning of October, that still means your application's under consideration, okay? If you're not rejected, then your application's still being reviewed. Medical schools do often offer something called second look, and this is an opportunity for accepted students to go back to the school and meet with first year students, second year students, faculty. They usually give you dinner. They might even give you like a gift bag. This is now their opportunity to recruit you, because students might have multiple acceptances and they get to go back to the school and really evaluate, where do I want to go? Medicine is pretty much the only professional program who does this. And then lastly, following up with a professional program. This has to be used sparingly. I know the wait process can be very long and painful, and students oftentimes, they want to continuously call admissions offices and check the status of their application. Okay? There are times where checking the status of your application is the right thing to do, and there are times where it's overused and you kind of become a pest to the school. And you don't want an admissions office to think of you as like a bugaboo, right? Like, oh my gosh, this student calls every Friday at 2:00 to check the status of their application. So this is a long process. There's a lot of waiting to this process, and it's good to understand that. If you want to send an update letter or a letter of continued interest, this would be something that you would do to let a medical school or professional school know of any changes in your application, right? Things, maybe it's been 4 to 6 months since you've submitted a secondary application, but you haven't been rejected. So you want to let them know, hey, I'm still interested. Here are the types of things that I've done since I submitted my primary application. You know, I'm still interested in your school. Maybe you're my first choice school. It's kind of letting them know you're still here, you're still interested. The other is a letter of intent. And that's very different. And sometimes students come in and they say, I want to send a letter of intent, when really they mean, I want to send an update letter. A letter of intent should be used even more sparingly. A letter of intent is for somebody who's been waitlisted or alternate listed, and they want to tell a professional school, if you accept me, I promise, I confirm that I will come to your school. Do not say that if you don't mean it. Okay, so this again, letter of intent you have to use sparingly. So if you've been accepted at one school and you're on an alternate list at another school and you really want to go to that school, and you say, if you accept me, I will come here, and then you get accepted somewhere else and you're like, oh, psych, never mind, I'm actually going to go to this other school, that would be very unprofessional, and you definitely would not want to do that. So you never want to tell a school, I absolutely will come here, unless you absolutely mean it. Okay, so letter of intent and an update letter are different things. Both should be used very sparingly. The last slide that I have for you guys is some resources. I recognize that after this interview, people aren't going to be fully prepared to walk into an interview and feel confident. So the AAMC does provide a lot of really good interviewing tips that are very translatable across multiple professional programs. One is preparing for an interview in general, and one is preparing for MMIs. So those are aspiring doc sheets that are very helpful in understanding what's the purpose of an interview, what you might be asked, how to prepare, how to respond, how to follow up. A lot of the same things that we've talked about today. Jessica Friedman, who's a physician, writes a lot about applications, personal statement writing, and interviewing. So she has a lot of books out there. The ADEA and Go Dental both provide tips on interviewing for dental schools. The AACP provides an interview workshop, particularly for interviewing for pharmacy. It's a PowerPoint presentation that's available on their website. There are some brochures from the National Association of Advisors for Health Professionals. You can definitely visit the school's website where you're going to be interviewing, because they might even put some tips and suggestions for interviewing, particularly at their school. You'll likely find that under prospective students. They might even share with you how many interview offers they extend and what type of interview format it will be. Will it be traditional, group, MMI, open, closed, or partially closed? So that information might even be available on their website. Lastly, the two other resources, the Career Center, they do some mock interview preparation. Their preparation is more for professional skills and professional etiquette, interviewing techniques, so that you can kind of see what your body language and your posture are. You can practice formulating questions. Where getting a mock interview with somebody in the Health Professions Advising Center, we're going to ask you more questions specific to the health professions. Both are valuable in different ways, but if you're also concerned about body language, eye contact, your ums and ahs or awkward pauses, you can even get additional resources at the Career Center.